When I'm in New York and I spend time walking from place to place, I'm always surprised to be in the middle of some of the world's most modern architecture. And I round the corner, and there stands the building for a church that's over 200 years old. The Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church is located right next to some of the most exclusive merchants in the world. And this is a pretty good illustration of what this curriculum, based on Chuck Colson's book, The Faith, is going to be about. Here on the streets of New York, it's easy to see our modern world, and also the challenges it presents to Christian ideas and thoughts to go forward in this changing context. You know, Christianity's always had a rich rooting in orthodoxy, but yet as we move forward into our time today, it's always been able to operate within the changing context. And although Jesus' commands to his followers, they've never changed, sometimes it's hard to live up to those ideals and to still know what's true and not true, and how to be faithful and yet relate to our friends and our neighbors. Over the next 6 sessions, you will have the opportunity to listen in on several conversations Chuck and I recently had related to the ideas relayed in his book, The Faith, Given Once for All. It was the opportunity of a lifetime for me to ask questions and sit at the feet of a modern-day patriarch of the faith and dig deeper into the important fundamentals of Christianity that he has worked so hard to model and express over his lifetime. For me, this wasn't the first time Chuck Colson had deeply impacted the way I viewed the Christian faith. In fact, a few years ago, a good friend of mine had recommended I read his book, How Now Shall We Live? And when I did, my eyes were opened to a much bigger picture of what Christianity was all about. You know, at the time it seemed revolutionary, yet it was so grounded in orthodox and so grounded in history that I couldn't help but embrace it. And the Christian faith made sense to me. You know, it wasn't just one of those things that only made sense inside the Christian circle, but it actually was a faith that could make sense to my friends, my neighbors, my colleagues. And so my hope is that this study and these series of discussions that you're about to have will do the same for you. It starts by understanding the essentials of our faith and how they play themselves out in our very progressive cities and neighborhoods without losing 1 ounce of that rich 2,000-year-old history that Christianity brings to us. In fact, our history is fascinating, but even more than that, Christianity today has something very real to say and to be in the midst of this new space and time. You know, Chuck, the current context of our culture is really pretty negative to this idea of Christianity. I mean, it seems that Christianity is losing momentum. People sometimes don't even want to call themselves Christian. And I wonder, how would you describe what Christianity is and how it really surpasses today's context?
Well, I don't think people understand. I don't think Christians understand. I don't think the culture understands. And certainly the younger generation, which you've surveyed, and written that great book on Christian that is a wake-up call to the church, it results in the fact that we really have never defined what Christianity is. People come into churches, they worship, they sing their hymns, their little ditties, and then they think that that's what religion is. It isn't. I was at a luncheon recently, and I asked a group of senior Christians, and these are elders in churches and some pastors, and I got talking about the clash of civilizations going on in the world right now, and I could see their eyes glazing over. They're wondering what's that got to do with Christianity. So I stopped impulsively, and I said, what is Christianity? And there was a long pause, and then one fellow stuck his hand up kind of sheepishly and said, well, it's love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. I said, yeah, your neighbor is yourself. That's the great commandment. But what's Christianity? I expected them to say a religion, maybe Jesus, a relationship with Christ. They went all over the lot. I was appalled. See, Christianity is much more than just a collection of Bible verses. It's much more than a relationship with Jesus. It is a way of seeing all of reality. It's a worldview. Logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Logos means all knowledge that could ever be known to the Greeks. That's what it meant, and that's the Greek word that's used in the New Testament. So people cannot understand Christianity unless they understand it as a system of life and thought affecting every area of life, which is not just church life, but which is your art, science, law, politics, neighborhood, family, everything. Once you understand that, and once you understand what it really stands for, then you get a very different picture of Christianity than what the world is getting today.
And this is profound, Chuck, to this idea of Christianity, because I think what we're seeing in some of the research we did is that this generation hasn't understood Christianity to be something that relates to all of the world. And you're the first one that I heard really articulate this well, where you said Christianity is the thing that makes sense of the world.
Yeah, well, it's the way you understand the world. And everybody has a worldview. Everybody goes through life. I don't care whether you're a believer, a non-believer, whether you're a Jew, syncretist, it doesn't matter. You've got a worldview. You've got some basic premises that you think about life. And you say, that informs what I do and how I see things. So I have a passion, deep passion at this juncture of my life to do the very best job I can in educating the church and Christian believers on what Christianity is. A worldview based on some fundamental truths that were given, as the title of my new book says, once for all. Jude's wonderful words to the early church. Even in the beginning, there was questions about, what is it we believe? And he basically said, I felt I had to write you to urge you to contend for the faith that was once for all entrusted to the saints. And if somebody says he's a Christian and doesn't know the faith which was once for all entrusted to the saints from the apostles to today, canonized in the scriptures, if somebody doesn't get this, then they're not going to be able to live the faith, they're not going to be able to even know what they believe, and certainly they can't defend it. And the result is that Christianity gets defined by people in the popular caricatures that have influenced your generation.
But the thing I love too, Chuck, about the way you write the book, The Faith, and anything that you do is you really go back historically and you try to capture what did the early church look like? What were the essentials? What did it look like then? Which I think in today's times is important, because in the West we're sort of pursuing this new path and pioneering new territory, and it's more important than ever that we get rooted and anchored back into what the faith has always been about. What are some of those truths that are essential to the faith?
Well, we're going to be understanding the whole question of truth and whether it's knowable, because that's really up for grabs in the postmodern era that we live in. First of all, there is a God, and God is. He is the overarching creator of everything. And I think that's a very defensible proposition. He has spoken, and he has given us truth, and truth is knowable because we have both the gift of the scriptures and the gift of reason, which God gives us so we can understand, see what is made before us. But he gave us a free will, and this is so essential to remember, because people are calling us theocrats today. That's the last thing you want to call a Christian, because we don't believe conversion can be forced. We believe it's an act of God's grace, and we are free to live in freedom under that grace. But we fell because we disobeyed God, the fall. God, however, responded. He invaded earth in the person of Jesus, and that was the kingdom coming, God's kingdom coming to defeat the reign of Satan. Then you understand all the implications of the cross, which is absolutely essential. That's central to the Christian faith, to understand the implications of it. But you also got to understand, how could there be a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one and three? So the Trinity, we'll talk about that, I hope, in this series, because it is so important. I've had my own private survey. I've yet to find somebody who can define it and explain it and defend it. Yet it's the principal point of attack on us by Muslims. Then what happens when you're saved? Is it just you? No. There are implications of being saved, and it's going to reflect in the way in which you live your life. It's going to reflect in reconciliation with others. It's going to reflect the fact that you come into a community and live with others. Christianity is not a solo exercise. It's not a lone ranger. You're part of a community, inherently part of a community by virtue of being a Christian. And then what are the implications of that for culture around us, and for life, and for how we live, and for holiness, growing in holiness? The whole purpose of the object of the Christian life is to grow in holiness. And then, of course, that means a deep respect for life. Catholics see it as part of the gospel, and evangelicals see it as integral to the gospel, the respect for life. And finally, history is going to have an end, and people know this. It's amazing how intuitively people understand it. And we believe that's when Christ returns, and there will be judgment. And then I think we have to see Christianity's relationship to other worldview systems, how it plays out, because that ultimately is the test of its validity.
And this idea that God is, I mean, this is central, obviously, to this view of Christianity that has in some ways overwhelmed the view that a lot of Christians have today, where it's about me and God.
You hear this constant talk today that all that matters is a relationship with Jesus. No, much more than that. It's the God of creation who exists whether I realize it or not. I mean, this is why Romans 1 says that which has been made is made evident to them, so people are without an excuse because you can see. Or Psalm 19 talks about the heavens declare the glory of God. We can see him in the creation around us. I know I had an experience a few years ago which was really drove this home to me. I went through a dark night of the soul. I had 2 of my 3 kids with cancer, serious case, one of them in particular, and a lot of surgery and radiation and chemo. And I was having some other problems at the time in the ministry. And I used to get up in the middle of the night and I'd say, God, you know, I've been serving you for 30 years. Is this what happens to those of us who are believers? And can't you do something? Prayers didn't get answered. I went through about 3 or 4 months of a really tough spiritual agony. And then I was at a friend's house in North Carolina for a little break in August. Patty and I were there to get a little rest. And I went onto the porch one morning, and there, rising out of the mist, were those gorgeous Blue Ridge Mountains, the gorgeous sight. And I was struck with the awe of what I was looking at, and it hit me like a thunderbolt. God is God whether I experience him or feel him or not. He is the cosmic creator. And so who am I to be challenging this? Who am I to be questioning this? God in his providence and in his sovereignty will do as he wills, and I am simply his servant. After reflection on that, I realized that was a turning point in my life. And it was also a great lesson, because those prayers were eventually answered. Both of my kids are doing fine. The problems have worked out. You know, we go through valleys in life. It's all part of Christian living. But God's still there, and he's still in charge.
And just like God is, and he exists outside of whether we believe that or not, the same is true of truth. And I know one of the things you've written a lot about and spoken a lot about is just your concern for how much truth is under attack today. Could you explain?
Yeah, Francis Schaeffer, who some of the viewers will remember, was the great prophet, I think, of the last part of the 20th century, kind of an eccentric guy out of the mountains of Switzerland with knickers and little goatee and funny high-pitched voice, but he used to say, the issue today is truth, truth, flaming truth. And he argued if there is no truth, then you cannot rely upon there being a God. And everything in life collapses. There's no foundation for us. And people today, because of the era of relativism, which has particularly permeated your generation, majority of the American people believe there's no such thing as truth, and even more shocking, 64% of the American people say there's no such thing as absolute truth. 54% of evangelicals say there's no such thing as absolute truth. Now put this together for me if you can, Gabe. I don't know. Somebody in their mind says, I believe in Jesus Christ, and he says, I am the truth, but I don't believe in truth. You can't connect those two. We're schizophrenic when we talk that way. Of course there is truth. Certain things are true. Now, what do we mean by truth is the critical question. Truth is that which conforms to reality. Truth is the way things are. Truth is a roadmap. And I pull one up on my computer, and I want to go from Washington to Harrisburg, and I take the roadmap and I end up in Pittsburgh. That wasn't an accurate map. And then I take another roadmap and I end up in Richmond. Well, that's not an accurate map. And finally I get one that takes me to Harrisburg. That's true. It's the same thing in life. You can look at the ways in which the various competing ideas and philosophies and theologies, you take a look at the way they present an explanation of life, and some work and some don't. Well, I say Christianity is the most rational way of understanding reality, and the most winsome, the most hopeful, the most wonderful way.
You know, a lot of young people today are skeptical of the truth. You know, how do you see this playing out in their life?
Well, I found you can teach even teenagers something. They're very skeptical at the beginning. If I have a group of teenagers, I'll say, how many of you believe in absolute truth? And even Christians, and they all look around. Nobody's raising their hands. I said, well, let me just ask you a question, because I believe the truth is written on the heart. I said, I believe you know it intuitively. Walk up to a street corner. There's an old lady standing there with shopping bags in her hands, and the traffic is whizzing by. You've got three choices. You can help her across, you can ignore her, or you can push her into the traffic. Which is right? Kids all chuckle and laugh. I said, now, how many of you believe there's absolute truth? All the hands go up. It's very interesting, but at Harvard today, there's a scientist who's discovered what he calls the moral gene, the part of the brain that processes moral truth, and he tries to explain that this was wired in by evolution, by an impersonal, random process, and boggles the mind. People can make that argument with a straight face. What Romans says, Romans 2, Paul says, the law is written on the heart. We know it. It's part of the way we are made in the image of God. And once you awaken that in people, they get it immediately. I think you can prove that there is truth and it is knowable. And I think people basically know it in their hearts. Now, the prime way we know it as Christians, although you can't say this to other people because they don't believe it, is we believe God revealed himself in the Scripture. We believe God spoke. And I remember when I first heard that as a brand new Christian, I heard God spoke, and I thought, well, God, I haven't heard God's voice. How did he speak? And I remember thinking, well, the Bible is truth because Christians say it's truth, and the Bible professes to be truth. All Scripture is inspired by God, that is breathed out by him. But could that really be so? And it wasn't until I got in the course of studying over the years that I realized, archaeological discoveries support the accuracy of this book to an uncanny extent. The discoveries of the Q documents, the Dead Sea Scrolls, proved that Psalm 22 was written well before the Maccabean era, before crucifixions were invented, and yet it talks about a crucifixion. And you begin to see, as the evidence mounts, what Paul Johnson, the great British historian, says: it is not the people of faith who have to fear the further course of scientific and archaeological discovery. It's the skeptics, because the more we know about this, the more we realize. And if you go back, as I did in writing this book, and something I really recommend for everybody, go back to the early era of the church, the first 5 centuries, what's called the patristic era, because the church had a unity and a dynamism that it desperately needs to recover today. Desperately. This book, The Faith, is an appeal to people to come together, be of one mind, one heart, seek unity, seek the strength of the community of Christians and believers, and go back and look at the early church, and you will see that's when they were putting the Bible together in the various councils that met. That's when the creeds were embraced, and that's when the truth that was directly handed down from the apostles was put into this document under the influence of the Holy Spirit. You can trust this book. So yeah, there are all kinds of ways to know truth, and sometime we'll get into them all. You've heard me on many of them.
You know, Chuck, one of the challenges can be when we talk about truth and it being knowable and sort of the intellectual logic and reason and rationale for why it exists. You know, I've seen in some older generations this sense to hold on to those doctrines and to believe those truths, but yet be challenged to really share those in love. And it's almost like, and sometimes we can be right, but if we're belligerent or we don't have a sensitivity to people who aren't necessarily aspiring to that same intellectual assent, it can go nowhere.
I'm really glad you raised that point, Gabe, because one of the reasons that the Christian faith is in bad repute today, not only in the public's mind, but of course in the caricatures and of course in the views of the young people, is that we don't smile. We know the truth and we're going to defend it, and we don't put all these people down that are trying to challenge us. Look, this is a great proposal, as we'll discuss later in a later session. Christians can't impose anything. Luther opposed theocracy because he said you can't coerce conversion, because then it's not a conversion. The Christian church welcomes everybody. The Christian church makes the most loving, all-embracing proposal. And what we got to do is explain it to people. I think Christianity fails today because it isn't being explained. It isn't being explained because people don't know what they believe. They don't know why they believe it, and they don't know why it matters. And if you don't, if I am building my life on something I can't explain, I'm a fool to begin with. But secondly, I'm not going to win anybody over to my point of view. I've taken a lot of non-believers, hardened non-believers, and talked to them about how Christianity plays out in life. And, oh, that's great. I mean, they really get, really? I didn't know that. Of course they didn't know it, because we're not telling them.
Some in the younger generation aren't as interested, and you could win the argument, but they're still not attracted to what it is that you're talking about. And I think it's led a lot of this generation to question whether Christianity is real because they've heard a lot of rhetoric, they hear a lot of these facts and truths, but yet they see very little demonstration in people's lives. And so this generation's starting to really work that out, and you're seeing probably a movement back to doing more deeds and focusing on the action that goes with the faith. Are there concerns about that?
And I've heard the expression, we want deeds, not creeds. And having been in 600 to 700 prisons around the world, spending most of my life doing this, much of my life doing this, I laugh when I hear that, because it is the creed that makes me do the deed.
Yeah.
If I didn't believe Christ was risen from the dead, if I did not believe Christ was alive today, sitting at the right hand of the Father, orchestrating what is happening in life, if I did not believe the Holy Spirit was in me, I wouldn't go in those prisons. That's the last place I'd go.
Right.
Plus, I would think the inmates are worthless, useless. They're useless eaters. They're costing us money. Get rid of them, which is what a lot of people think. So what has caused, we'll get into this in the later sessions, but the history of Christianity is replete with Christians giving themselves for others. That's how Christianity grew and exploded. So what you're seeing today is self-centeredness of the culture being absorbed in the church. And it's sickening to see it happen, because this isn't Christianity. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of Christianity actually practiced, which is the problem.
You know, one thing you said that was profound for me was that Christianity is not just about redeeming souls, but redeeming the entire culture. Could you describe that?
Christianity is about not only the Great Commission, which is to make disciples and baptize them and bring them into the fellowship, and disciples means learners. It doesn't mean just people coming in as recruiting into the church. It means repentant sinners who want to see their lives transformed. But we cut off the other half of Christianity, which is to redeem the fallen structures of society, to get out into every single walk of life, to bring Christian truth to bear in everything we do. And when people get that, it's exciting, it's thrilling, because they begin to see how their life can affect lives around them.
I hope you've enjoyed this opening session and hearing Chuck's very unique perspective on Christianity. If you could do one thing, it would be to just start to train your mind to see Christianity as an overarching way of life. It's not just a set of beliefs or propositions. And as we continue to study all these great principles and ideas about Christianity, don't just view them as old dusty doctrines like this old building set in the middle of a modern, beautiful New York City, but recognize that the past actually points us forward to the future, and that as we stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before us, we can see much farther than we ever could alone.